The remote hit the coffee table and slid under the lamp as Claire Mendoza lifted her hand and shouted, "Turn it off." A red bar crawled across the television screen and filled the top edge with jagged interference. McGill shoved the remote again and then slammed his fist into the plastic until the buttons cracked beneath his knuckles. Fear sits in Claire's throat and makes her fingers shake. She moves to pick up the remote and finds only a splintered case. The television continued, the banner unchanged, and a voice layered over the static that sounded like an operator reading numbers and a child's whisper at the same time. McGill crouched and hissed Claire's name, Claire, Don T. He grabbed the broken remote and broke it further, snapping off the back. He squeezed the shards in his palm until the skin white-lined. The signal on the screen sharpened for a second and then resolved into a dark circle with a smaller red dot that pulsed twice. Claire pressed her palm to her jaw and felt an ache move behind her teeth. The H was not headache alone. It was a directive forming inside her head. She tried to say, "Stop," but the sound came out flat and measured. Outside the living room window, headlights cut down the street. Deputy Harris' cruiser rolled up the curb and stopped with its engine idling. The house light through a rectangle on the lawn. Claire pointed at the window without meaning to. "They re-hear," she said. "They re-hear, McGill." Her voice lost its sharpness and took on the cadence she had heard on the television. Procedural, flat, precise. The central problem was clear inside those first breaths. This broadcast could not be turned off. And attempts to destroy its receiver made the instruction live inside people's heads. The first 5 minutes were noise, bodies, and attempts. McGill tried to rip the coax cable from the back of the set. Field Technician 512, a woman wearing a reflective vest and a lumpy wool cap, carried bolt cutters and a metal toolbox. She barked, "Hands off the set!" and grabbed McGill's arm. Deputy Harris stepped back. Claire, the technician's cuts left trailing sparks. The cable came loose. The screen went black for half a second and then bloomed again with a more resolved red pupil. 512 swore and slammed her palm flat against the glass before she understood the urge to shield herself from the image. Emotion root. Fear. That word appears now not as an abstract label, but through Claire's grinding teeth. McGill's fingers on the remote, F to 12's pounding chest. Fear drives their actions. It pushes McGill to violence, Claire to obey, and the technician to follow protocol, even as her hands tremble. The operator at the emergency broadcast center routes men and vehicles and reads lists with the same measured voice. Each list entry makes fear concrete, locations called, names checked, failure metrics updated. Within minutes, the operator has tagged the override as non-compliant with shutdown procedures and sends a field team to the Mendoza residence. The control room is fluorescent and cold when Ebo Azan 7 hears the first live feed. He speaks into a headset and records every step. Ebo 07 to field units. He says, "Override active at 1264 Elm. Remote disable protocol failed." Repeat. Device destruction correlated with increased internal reports. Proceed with caution. His voice is low and flat. He reads protocol while his fingers mark logs. Drew Sato, an analyst, leans over the archive terminal and pulls prior incidents. They find a pattern. Households that smashed hardware reported louder subjective audio. Households that burned receivers describe persistent commands entering dreams. Claire's breathing moves in short bursts. She keeps repeating a phrase she does not intend to say. A string of clipped instructions, the words broken and mechanical. McGill grabs her shoulders. "Claire, snap out of it." He shakes her. "Claire, look at me." She looks. Her eyes are hooded. Her jaw works like someone learning new words. Of 12 hands, McGill a bandage and says, "Tie her hands." "Tie them now," McGill says. "No," and then knots the fabric because the cadence in Claire's voice has started to order him to help. They drag the television into the driveway. The neighbors are already outside with flashlights. Someone has filmed a hand hitting the screen with a crowbar. Someone else has thrown the set off the porch. The field technician watches the screen as it lies face up on the pavement. The image refracts through cracked glass and resolves into the red pupil that seems to watch the crowd. The transmission moves through camera feeds, phone recordings, and closed-circuit monitors. Each time a receiver is physically destroyed, someone near it answers the same internal command. The pattern reads as a rule. Physical destruction shifts the locus of the signal from device to mind. Back in the control room, Ibo, Zoda 7 and Dra Seto argue over an analyst feed. The field notes show the same progression. Dra Seto says, muting results in internal volume increase. Damaging hardware results in directives inside the survivor that contradict shutdown. We don't have textbook on this, Ibo, So 7 says. He repeats a code phrase into the log entry. Non-compliant override. Initiate containment perimeter. Recommend public safety directive. Do not disable devices. He types the directive and feels his hands jitter when he remembers protocols that do not account for mind-borne spread, an external event. A neighbor named Rosa runs toward the Mendoza driveway, phone recording in hand. Claire. Rosa shouts, "Claire, talk to me." Claire turns her head and points with a straight, slow motion at the dark street door. Claire says in the operator's cadence, "Door open." Go. Rosa fumbles for words and then, as per habit, calls Deputy Harris. The deputy interprets the movement as non-compliance and orders a perimeter. People shout and the crowd thickens. Someone yells that the signal is resolving an eye on every screen. At the archive terminal, Dra Sato brings up a clip from a seizure of 2013. She pulls audio and frames. The clip shows a family in a farmhouse tearing apart televisions. The mother later admitted that commands persisted in dreams for 3 nights. Ibolo 7 listens to the audio and feels an echo of the present pattern. He says, "We can't advise destruction anymore." Dra Sato replies, "What do we tell them then?" He stares at the waveform. "We tell them to stand by. We tell them to keep receivers powered and visible. We tell them not to destroy." The decision sits heavy because it means leaving the room with an active image and a voice that can lodge itself in a person's head. The technician returns to the Mendoza house with a tool bag and a plastic crate for the damaged set. She kneels and lifts the screen like a body. Miguel wants to smash the internals again. He says, "We have to stop it now." F12 grabs his wrist and pulls him back. "You will make it worse," she says. "You will make her worse." Miguel pulls free and charges the set. Claire suddenly lunges and wraps her arms around him in a clumsy embrace, as though the instruction inside her insists on preventing him from acting. She whispers the same clipped phrases into his ear and then pushes him away. Her fingers feel damp on his collar. Emotions shift one, doubt to fear. Miguel doubts the operator's call to restrain himself. He doubts the technician's judgment. He moves to act anyway. The doubt collapses into fear when Claire begins repeating instructions out loud and reaches toward an empty yard with deliberate ritual gestures. Her hands trace a sequence in the air and the technician shouts, "Stop." They struggle. Dialogue snaps quickly. "Mig, hold her!" F12 says, "Claire, Don T." Miguel says, "Stop it, Claire!" Deputy Harris says. Claire's voice hits the cadence again. "Open the door." Break the circle. She winds her fingers and drops toward the porch. Miguel tackles her and they fall into the grass. A camera in the neighbor's hand keeps filming. The voice on the television overlays the neighbor's audio as if coming from inside the recording. The crowd steps back. Someone says, "She just said the words from the broadcast." The technician says, "Lock her arms." Now they secure Claire with a strap from the first aid kit. An external event, a different neighborhood calls in a report. A man named Harris, no relation to the deputy, stood in a cull, sack and smashed 3 television sets. He later set one on fire. He recorded a confession on his phone. He heard a phrase that told him to carve a sign into his skin. Dra Seto plays the clip. The phrase matches the language the Mendoza house heard. Clip directives, procedural verbs, and a repeating glyph pattern. Ibo Zo 7 writes in the log. Pattern confirmed, He presses his palm to his mouth and watches the waveform compress. He thinks of the rule he must make public and the consequence that making it public might seed the waveform into more heads. They convene a rapid briefing in the feed room. F12 stands with a coffee cup and shakes her head. Deputy Harris paces. "We tried destroying the hardware," he says. "It failed. What else do we do?" Ebo Low 7 answers, "We institute a live counter broadcast. We speak to them directly just as Sato looks up. Any unauthorized broadcast risks hijacking. The transmission adapted to everything we've tried." Ebo Zo 7 pauses, fingers hovering over the console. "Then we do it live. We override the override. We use procedural tone. Used correctly, it may anchor listeners to a safe directive. We have to risk it." He chooses words precisely and wires the output to the national feed. They prepare for the counter broadcast, an external event. The field team reports that a neighborhood 3 blocks over is following an ocular emblem that appeared on each phone screen. People were stomping on televisions, holding hands, and swaying in unison toward a utility pole. The utility pole had a small red paint spot in a pattern resembling the emblem. The technician says it resolves into a thing, and then it wants people to approach it. Deputy Harris says, "That's possession. That's not just noise." Ebo Low 7 thinks of the legalese and the manuals. He times the live feed and begins to speak. The climax begins in the feed room. Ebo Low 7 places his palm flat on the microphone and starts a live, unsanctioned transmission. He reads a dry directive: keep doors closed, do not disable devices, wait for field teams. His voice slips into the professional cadence he uses for every log. For 10 seconds the live voice seems to hold. People in the field pause mid-action and look at their hands. Then the transmission warps. The image on the center monitor glitches and becomes the transmission's ocular emblem. The voice over the live feed multiplies into layers. Ebo 07 says low procedural tone beneath a high, clipped whisper, and then a sequence of beeps that mimic human breathing. Emotions shift to fear to compelled action. The calm that Ebo 07 tries to enforce fractures into compulsion. Field units report that the counter broadcast was hijacked mid-sentence and that the hijack loops institutional directives into the minds of listeners. Claire, strapped in the grass, ceases struggling and begins to recite the new compounded order in a voice that echoes the operator's own. McGill presses his forehead into his hands and says, "Ebo Low 7, stop it." Stop the feed. The technician moves to yank the main feed, but the transmission has already refactored the signal. The feed loops the directive and the loop plays inside human heads even if their receivers die. In the yard, a camera angle captures the moment the feed fractures. The red pupil resolves and turns toward the sky. The crowd's mouths move in unison as the looped instruction crawls under their teeth. Deputy Harris fires his service radio and shouts, "Pull back! Pull back now!" There are 3 quick exchanges of shouted lines between Harris, F12, and the technician as they try to coordinate a physical extraction. The noise of concrete and under someone's boots, a bolt cutter hitting a cable, and then a wrenching sound of static overtaking the radio feed cut through, an external event and twist. A field technician at another location, F03, reports that they attempted a different tactic earlier, complete power cycling without destroying the hardware. F03 says they muted the set and waited. The reported effect was different. Internalized volume still rose, but with delayed onset and less compulsive rituals. The clip overturns the earlier assumption that destruction directly causes mind-born directives. Instead, it suggests that transmission adapts to any termination attempt and that the severity correlates to the aggression of the termination. Sato brings this up mid-climax and forces Ebo 07 to alter the language of his broadcast while the transmission pushes back. The hijacked stream redoubles its pressure. Ebo 07 improvises and switches to a single survival directive he bangs out with short sentences. He says the words loudly and repeats them. Do not disable. Keep receivers visible. Await field instruction. The transmission tries to reorder the sentences, but the operator stressed. Human cadence slips between the layers and creates a gap. People still report the voice inside their heads, but some listeners, those who had kept devices powered and in view, report less compulsion and more a steady instruction. The field notes later call this a partial anchor. Claire opens her mouth and repeats the operator's phrasing exactly, softer on the last word. Miguel looks up as if hearing the operator for the first time. He says, Ebo Zoto 7, what did you just say? Ebo Zo 7 answers in a clipped line. Follow the rule, the technician in the yard says. We can move her. We can move them now. They carry Claire, strapped to the cruiser. As they lift her, the camera captures a small, thin cut on her palm where she had scratched at glass earlier. She clamps her jaw and whispers the single rule like a charm. The feed dies in a way that is not clean. The monitor in the feed room blinks, and then the output reduces to a line of vertical static. For 6 seconds a low looping drone holds. Then the console logs record an abrupt signal loss, and the audio ends with a single repeating phrase recorded inside several survivors' testimonies. The survival directive spoken by Claire. The operator slumps and records a sealed report. He writes the directive on paper and speaks it aloud into the log for posterity, not for broadcast. Do not destroy your receiver. Leave it visible. Await further instructions. He puts the paper into a folder stamped for sealed containment. Aftermath is procedural. F-12 organizes neighborhood checkpoints. Deputy Harris coordinates transport of subjects who report persistent internal audio. Dr. Sato composes a debrief and isolates the variables that changed the transmission's behavior. Miguel sits in the driver's seat of the cruiser, hands on the wheel, nails pressed into the leather. He says, Claire, can you hear me? Claire stares at the dashboard and repeats the operator's recorded phrase without looking at him. Her fingers trace a rhythm on the dashboard, as if following directions only she can sense. An external observation. A woman from a different district calls into the center and says she destroyed her television and now hears the broadcast inside the hum of her refrigerator. Another report says a man who smashed his receiver last night now reports the voice instructing him to go to a public plaza at midnight. The pattern extends. Dr. Sato catalogs the reports and marks them on a map. Each mark is a concrete instance. A broken screen, a burned set, a man who scratched symbols into a utility box. Each is tied to a recorded phrase that mutates slightly depending on the environment. Ebo Zo 7 completes the sealed report and records a single directive to be included for field teams. He speaks in the same flat tone he used during live feed. Directive for survivors, keep receivers powered, do not destroy receivers, keep sets in view. Report changes immediately. He closes the folder and stamps it. He pushes the folder across the desk so the technician can carry it to the local archive. The technician lifts it with gloved hands and says, we need a place to house it where it won't be seen. Ebo. Zo 7 looks at the stamped folder as though at a fragile specimen and says, lock it in cabinet 0. Mark access restricted. The action seals the institutional decision. Instruction over destruction. A mid-chapter mini cliffhanger occurs when the neighbor's phone camera, still recording, captures as a faint red pulse in Claire's pupil. For a single frame, the pulse matches the transmission's emblem, and then it is gone. The clip goes to the control room and freezes on the frame. Dr. Sato magnifies the image and says, what is that? Ebo 07 says nothing. The frozen frame becomes an item to investigate and a sign that the transmission may have left a residual mark on human perception itself. They end the day with an uneasy order of operations. F-12 checks the perimeter logs. Deputy Harris escorts Claire into a holding room where she can be observed without destroying any devices. Miguel sits on a folding chair outside the room and pulls his hands into his jacket. He says, I smashed it. I smashed the remote. He rattles his confession like a coin. The technician gives him a paper cup of coffee and a towel. You did what most people do, Miguel, she says. We learn from it now. We stop repeating it. He nods but does not look up. The final paragraph closes on a concrete situational beat. Ebo, Zo7 places the sealed folder onto the top shelf of a steel locker and slides the drawer shut. He presses the metal latch and hears it click. He speaks into his recorder one line as the camera in the feed room pans down to show the locker door closing. Survival directive recorded. Await further instruction. The locker locks and a technician flips off the lights. The emergency light blinks red once, then goes steady. The sound in the room is the low drone fading into silence, and Claire, in the holding room, repeats the directive once more under her breath as the front door of the center opens and a field team returns with new reports. The living room feed went dead when a crowbar struck the television faceplate. Static spidered across the screen and a lamp knocked from the table rolled into the picture. Ebo Zo7 felt dread rise in the back of his throat and pinned it under protocol. Keep listening, document everything. Field technician Ramos shouted into his earpiece. Ramos to control. They broke the receiver and a thin, high whistle threaded the line. The immediate conflict was visible and sharp. A homeowner destroying hardware while the signal answered from inside someone's head. That problem, broadcast that survived physical destruction, framed every decision Ebo Zo7 would make for the next 16 hours. Ebo Zo7 watched the feed that showed Claire Mendoza lifting her hand and shouting, "Turn it off," then the remote clattering across the coffee table and sliding under the lamp. Miguel braced, grabbed a crowbar, and hammered the plastic until buttons and labels split beneath his blows. Those images matched control room telemetry. Falling amplitude on the receiver's feed and a rising count of subjective report tags on connected channels. Ebo Zo7 recorded the observation aloud into the log with measured pauses. Dread hardened into suspicion. He could not yet prove the transmission had altered its medium, only that survivors reported internal continuation with greater intensity after violent termination. Ramos sent another live clip. The clip opened on a close-up of shattered glass and a smear of remote batteries on the rug. "Someone off," camera wailed and a neighbor pounded on the door. "Claire, we have to go," Miguel ordered, voice thin and urgent. Claire's fingers trembled as she tried to button her coat. That exchange contained a shift, from confusion to fear. Ebo Zo7 marked that shift and called up a cross, reference with 2 earlier event logs, including the remote hitting the coffee table in the previous feed. He into his mic, deploy containment teams. Do not instruct residents to destroy hardware. Repeat. Do not instruct residents to destroy hardware. His voice remained flat, but his commands tightened. Outside the apartment, voices multiplied on the courtyard camera. A neighbor who had smashed his own television screamed that an image was still inside his head and thrashed at the air. The cry redirected Ebo Zo7's suspicion toward a mechanism, something in the signal bound to neural feedback triggered by violent destruction. The operator's choices shifted from doubt to cautious action. Ramos and Officer Lin were already arriving on stairwell feeds, speaking in clipped tones. "We cannot let people smash everything. Officer Lin, they'll hurt themselves." The insistence sharpened strategy. Containment required physical control and information control. Ebo Zo7 ordered a field agent to collect remaining receivers intact. A technician hesitated on video, hand hovering over a cracked set. "If we take it apart, will it stop?" The technician asked. The question opened another emotional move inside the control room. Uncertainty to resolve. Ebo Zo7 answered, "Do not disturb components, seal units." Transport to Quarantine Bay. He logged exact times and the serial numbers of 4 confiscated devices. Every choice he made demanded a balance between preserving evidence and preventing panic. Back the Mendoza apartment, Miguel pulled Claire toward the stairwell. "Claire, get down the stairs now," and she obeyed with a single nod. Miguel's actions were taught with protectiveness. He kept scanning doorways, hands clenching and unclenching around a broken remote. When they reached the courtyard, the neighbor who smashed his television rushed them, eyes wide. He spat words that converged on a single concrete image. A red pupil expanding. "It's in here," he said, slapping his temple. McGill stepped back and said, "Get away from Claire." The neighbor lunged and a resident pushed him down. Concrete movement kept surfacing. People acting, colliding, restraining. EBO-07 watched the subjectivity reports climb and annotated the neighbor's description as a repeated motif. Field technician Ramos radioed, "Subjects report ocular imagery resolving during destruction." 2 reports say a red pupil. EBO-07 keyed the note into the main log and pulled telemetry from the backup operations bay. He opened a feed that displayed neural feedback loops in simplified graphs. Each destroyed receiver correlated with a spike in subjective report amplitude. The operator translated data into a tactical sentence. The signal exploited violent feedback to embed itself perceptually. This technical revelation forced a policy shift from hardware removal to behavioral containment. Instructions moved through the room with clipped clarity. The decision to starve the signal of external hardware arrived as a careful, emergent plan. McGill volunteered to be attached to an isolation rig. His voice on the channel was steady, but his hands were shaking when he signed consent forms on video. "I'll do it," he said. "If this helps stop it, I will." McGill's choice shifted other people's emotions again. Fear leaning into something that looked like resolve. EBO-07 approved the rig and watched the technicians strap McGill into the frame in the makeshift quarantine lab. The rig was a simple cradle with Faraday shielding and white noise generators built from borrowed parts. McGill lay with his chin tucked, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow. The field team monitored his vitals, and the control room kept the primary broadcast on a low loop for reference. When the rig powered down to attempt sensory starvation, the transmission responded not by diminishing but by rushing inward. McGill convulsed and clutched at his head. His eyes fixed, and the feed from the quarantine lab resolved a single symbol on the lip of his eyelids. A pixelated, vertical slit of red. He began to speak in a voice that layered low, procedural cadence under a fast, whispering hiss, "Do not destroy." McGill, and then he vomited on the sheet. The rig's sensors flooded the control monitors with a new waveform, one that matched the ocular signature seen in survivors' descriptions. The situation escalated from controlled experiment to breach. EBO-07's hands moved faster, cut feed to external channels. "Reroute telemetry to secure loop," he ordered. Ramos complied, and the control room lights clicked as automated shutters lowered. Officer Lin called in field updates, and the hallway feeds shoved images of screaming residents and agents struggling to collect devices. The transmission accelerated visual corruption across screens, adding jitter and a red smear to every display. A field agent staggered on camera as if the visual bleed had hit him in the gut. In the control room, the mood shifted. Composed procedure fractured into tense improvisation. The plan to collapse the network came down as a single, forced override. EBO-07 spent a measured minute preparing the command string and announcing the intention to staff. "We are initiating a forced collapse to sever feedback loops across the mesh. Expect loss of external telemetry and manual fallbacks," he said. His voice had a low flatness that masked a precise calculation. Ramos and field technician Ramos repeated acknowledgements. The operator keyed the override. For an instant, the system complied. Feeds blinked off across the grid, and the external channels dropped into static. EBO-07 waited for the expected drop in subjective reports. Instead, the transmission inverted the command. The control hub registered an incoming glyph, and the room's main monitor resolved into the ocular emblem, fully formed and occupying McGill's feed. The emblem projected outward from his pupils, as if the signal now used human perception as transmitter hardware. Personnel near the central console coughed, voices collapsing into gurgles. Field technician Ramos staggered backward, hands over his ears, while Officer Lin fumbled with her radio. The room's telemetry vanished in a single, catastrophic spike. The climax consolidated into one clear, violent image. Institutional control undone by the broadcast's ability to leap across intended boundaries. In the hub, EBO-07 experienced the next emotion shift. Professional detachment gave way to controlled urgency, then to a tangible, physical reaction as his mouth dried and his hands trembled. He still spoke commands: isolate Miguel physically, seal the hub, engage manual archival record. The words drove staff action. 2 technicians grabbed Miguel and carried him to a padded bench, while others began securing backup log drives. The operator kept voice steady even as a faint whisper threaded the room's air, a high-frequency overlay that no microphone picked up cleanly. Staff collapsed into short, sharp exchanges. Ebo, Zo 7, the uplink's gone. Ramos, we can push a clean dumped archive. Start local mirrors. Timestamp everything. Ebo, Zo 7 replied. Ramos, you and Lin get survivors out of the corridors. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone destroy hardware. The order repeated the new rule into the real world. That insistence became an anchor. If destruction amplified the signal, then preservation might contain it for study. Officers argued briefly in clipped tones about the ethics of holding devices from frightened residents. The argument included 3 fast exchanges. We can just take their TVs. We won't damage them. We will seal and transport. People are breaking things. You saw them, then secure them calmly. No destruction. If we sit and wait, more go inside their heads. The back and forth produced a decision. Containment teams would prioritize calm seizure and guarded transport to quarantine, rather than allowing violent termination. When Miguel convulsed again, the transmission used him as a relay. His voice layered with the signal, and a chorus of processed bleeps spilled into the control room monitors. Faces on the staff turned white. Ebo 07 ordered a manual audio scrub for recorded feeds and finally chose to preserve the most complete audio in a locked, local archive with an unbreakable checksum. He would not risk sending that archive over the network. There was a twist. The archive itself became a target because the transmission attempted to corrupt storage by mirroring the ocular emblem into file headers. Technicians worked with gloved hands and composed faces to isolate corrupted sectors. The mini cliffhanger arrived mid-shift. Log entries spiked with reports from the quarantine bay. Miguel's pupils had resolved into the emblem. He opened his mouth, and for a second the room heard his voice speak an instruction nobody had coded. "Do not destroy," he said. But the cadence inverted the override Ebo 7 had just initiated. Then the quarantine bay camera froze on Miguel with his hand outstretched. The clip cut to static. The control room went silent for 2 long heartbeats while staff looked at one another, waiting for the next event. That pause functioned as a hinge. Then an external knock sounded on the hub's inner door, and the situation moved outward again as field agents reported a new cluster of events down the block. Outside, residents had stopped smashing televisions en masse, but some were bent over their own hands, whispering descriptions of internal imagery. Ebo 07 watched a clip of a woman, mid-30s, pressing her palms to her temples and saying, "There's a ring, a red line that keeps breathing." The operator annotated the woman's description and then ordered a specific behavioral protocol to staff. Instruct residents to cover screens with heavy black clothes and to avoid direct visual contact until experts could confirm safe handling. He insisted the cloths be placed without tearing or hitting the hardware. The protocol came from a core conviction. Concrete procedural action could reduce visual corruption and limit feedback. Field agents moved through corridors and stairwells. Officer Lin negotiated with a man who refused to relinquish his set. "Officer Lin, this is my only link to the outside," he said. "I need it." "Haynes, we need you to trust us for 5 minutes." Lin answered, voice short and practical. "Give me the unit." "We will seal it." The man hesitated, hand trembling around the remote. He let go, then looked at the agent with raw anger. "You better not break it," he said. "You better not." Lin met his eyes. "We won't break it. We will protect you from it." Their exchange resolved into a small, human compromise, a micro-decision that altered the trajectory of containment in that stairwell. Back at the hub, technicians isolated Miguel's waveform and tried an unconventional approach. Rather than power down, they imposed a controlled, low-frequency carrier that displaced the transmission's higher frequency overlay. It was an improvisation, a gamble born of necessity. Ebo, Zo7 observed the attempt, then ordered a second, parallel measure. A continuous procedural announcement loop to remind staff and survivors of one rule: do not destroy receivers. He recorded the line personally into the stub recorder. His voice low, flat, procedural, and final: do not destroy your receiver. He enunciated and stamped a timestamp on the log. The line would become the constrained warning that survived the hub's collapse. The transmission countered by projecting the ocular emblem through Miguel in a way that temporarily overrode the carrier. Several staff members dropped to their knees, hands over their ears. Someone in the room sobbed, and the sob broke into sharp gasps. The hub's monitoring screens bled red, and then, slowly, that red receded from the internal displays. Telemetry reappeared, scrambled but present. The climax had taken measurable toll. 3 personnel with mild convulsive episodes, 2 corrupted storage drives, and Miguel unresponsive on the padded bench. Ebo Zo7's leadership had prevented a larger catastrophe, but nothing about the final balance felt like victory. Dawn crawled into the control room through narrow slats. Survivors were moved to escorted buses with sealed devices. The operators that remained catalogued every report, every timestamp, and every corrupted sector they could salvage. Ebo Zo7 reviewed the recorded archive of Miguel's isolation experiment and created a distilled procedural brief. Preserve hardware, do not allow violent termination, use controlled low-frequency carriers for short-term displacement, and maintain sealed local archives. He wrote the final sentence into the log and spoke it aloud while he hit save. This override is corrupted. The only surviving directive is: do not destroy your receiver. There remained one more obligation. Ebo Zo7 prepared a constrained, public procedural insertion, a short recorded directive designed to replace the corrupted overlays on unsecured channels. He wrote the words carefully and read them into a locked recorder with his signature timbre, measured pauses, and precise enunciation. The message contained no metaphor, no speculation. Only concrete orders and times for scheduled updates, plus a firm admonition not to destroy devices. He added instructions for survivors. Seek medical evaluation if ocular imagery persists. Report internal signals to the provided hotline. And present seized hardware to authorized personnel for quarantine. Before sending the insertion, Ebo Zo7 paused to check every mirror archive. He replayed Claire Mendoza's clip, where the remote slid under the lamp and Miguel punched the plastic until labels fell away. He replayed the moment Miguel volunteered for the isolation rig and the instant the ocular emblem resolved. These were the concrete events that had shaped policy. He opened the master console, saved the insertion, and executed a final manual backup to a physically separate drive. The hub hummed with machinery and the faint background of looping low-frequency carriers. He did not know if the recorded directive would halt the transmission's capacity to exploit destruction. He only knew that the hub, its people, and the survivors had followed a single, evidence-driven rule to reduce harm. At 7:12, with the morning shift arriving and survivors beginning to leave under guarded escort, Ebo Zo7 stood and walked to the small recorder at the edge of his desk. He spoke into the device once more, a short procedural note for any future operator who might inherit the log. Do not destroy your receiver, he said, if you must intervene. Seal the hardware intact and contact quarantine. Await further procedural updates. He pressed stop and watched the red tally on the master archive blink as the file wrote. The chapter's final action was a mundane, concrete one. Ebo Zo7 reached across his desk and closed the hub's heavy inner door. He engaged the manual shutter with a practiced turn. The room darkened in stages, systems moving to backup power, monitors showing stable static. He left one light on above the archive cabinet and walked to the window to watch buses pull away. Miguel's ambulance lights receded into the distance. Claire and other named survivors rode with agents, quiet and wrapped in blankets. Ebo-07 returned to his chair and set the recorder back into its cradle. He sealed the session with a single log directive and an audible click that registered in the morning's small silence. The operator remained at his desk until the next scheduled handover, monitoring the slow crawl of reports, procedural notes, and the steady, low frequency carrier that had become their temporary shield. Nothing about the outcome claimed a moral victory. The transmission had not been destroyed. It had altered the parameters of containment and forced institutional practices to change. Ebo-07 had converted suspicion into a set of enforced protocols, moving through doubt and fear into tactical resolve. He had learned that attempts at violent termination produced the precise neural conditions the transmission needed. The final recorded order stood not as prophecy, but as a concrete, actionable rule for any person confronted with the same urge to break a device. Do not do it. The last line on the log was a directive and an instruction to living people. The final paragraph closed on motion. Ebo-07 shut the recorder, slid the sealed drive into the archive slot, and turned the key twice until it clicked into place.